Great spirits, I seek your guidance in the water's flow. No.
You saved my ranch from fire. Now let me save your heart. The cowboy vowed to the Apache Maiden. The moon hung like a silver dollar over Bitter Creek, Arizona territory, casting shadows that danced between the saguaro cacti and mesquite trees. It was April 1882, and the desert held that peculiar coolness that comes just before dawn, when even the scorpions seek shelter and the coyotes finish their nightly hunt. Aiyana crouched beside the sacred spring, her fingers trailing through water that had flowed through this hidden canyon for longer than memory. The Apache called it Tubika, water that sees, because its surface reflected not just images, but truths that eyes alone might miss. Her grandmother had taught her the songs here before the cavalry came, before the screaming, before the silence that followed. At 24, she was perhaps the last who remembered the proper way to gather the healing herbs that grew where the spring met red rock. The settlers in the valley below didn't know she existed, or rather they knew of the ghost woman who sometimes left medicine bundles at the doors of sick children who disappeared before dawn could reveal her face. The Apache survivors scattered eastward knew, but they had their own sorrows to tend. Comment 1. If you love stories where cultures collide and hearts find unexpected homes. Tonight the water showed her something that made her breath catch. Fire, not the controlled flames of a hearth or campfire, but the angry orange tongues that meant destruction. She looked up following the spring's message and saw it with her earthly eyes. Down in the valley, perhaps 3 miles distant, the Morrison Ranch was ablaze. She should feel nothing. The Morrisons had arrived 2 summers ago, building their ranch on land where her people once wintered. But the spring had shown her more than flames. It had shown her a figure trapped inside, movements sluggish with more than smoke, and something in the water's revelation suggested this was no ordinary fire. Aiyana closed her eyes, hearing her grandmother's voice. Hatred is a fire that burns the one who carries it first. She had saved settlers before. The Baker child with pneumonia, old Mrs. Clement with the infected wound, always in secret, always at night. But this was different. This meant exposure, danger, possibly death. The water rippled, showing her the face of the trapped man more clearly. She didn't recognize him, but something in his features. A weariness that went bone-deep, eyes that had seen too much, reminded her of her own reflection after the massacre. Someone broken, trying to piece together reasons to continue. She made her choice. Aiyana moved through the darkness with the fluid grace of one who had learned stillness as survival. Her feet found the quiet places between loose stones, her body bent low to blend with shadows. The medicine bag at her waist held herbs for burns. She would need them. The knife at her hip had been her father's, its handle worn smooth by his palm, and now hers. As she descended toward the burning ranch, the acrid smell of smoke grew stronger, but underneath it, something else. Something wrong. This wasn't just wood smoke. There was a chemical tang like the mining operations she'd smelled near Tucson. Kerosene, perhaps, but mixed with something else. The ranch house was fully engulfed when she reached it, flames shooting through the roof in hellish pillars. The barn was starting to catch horses screaming in panic, but the spring had shown her true. Through a broken window she glimpsed a figure sprawled near the back door, unmoving despite the encroaching flames. No time for hesitation. Aiyana pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth, took a deep breath of clean air, and plunged through the shattered window. The heat hit her like a physical blow, searing her exposed skin. The man was larger than she'd expected, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a marshal's badge that gleamed in the firelight. His face was partially burned, his breathing shallow and wrong. Not just smoke inhalation. His lips had a strange tinge, his muscles locked in an unnatural rigidity. Poison. Someone had poisoned him before setting the fire. Aiyana hooked her arms under the man's shoulders, summoning strength her slender frame shouldn't possess. Her grandmother had taught her how the body could transcend its limits when necessity demanded. She dragged him backward inch by agonizing inch as burning timber crashed around them. A beam fell, showering sparks across her back. She bit through her lip to keep from crying out, tasting copper. The door was blocked by flames. The window she'd entered through seemed impossibly far. The smoke was thickening, threatening to claim them both. Then she remembered the root cellar. Most ranch houses had them and the trapdoor. Yes, there, partially hidden under a burning rug. She kicked the rug aside, singing her moccasins, and hauled open the heavy wooden door. The ladder down was intact. Getting an unconscious man down a ladder seemed impossible until she remembered how her uncle had taught her to move wounded warriors. She went down first, 3 rungs, then guided his body onto her shoulders, his weight nearly crushing her as she descended into darkness. The cellar was blissfully cool, though smoke was beginning to seep through the floorboards above. She dragged the marshal to the exterior storm doors, shouldered them open, and pulled him out into the clean night air, just as the house above collapsed in a symphony of destruction. They lay gasping on the ground. Well, she gasped, while he remained frighteningly still. In the light of the burning ranch, she could better assess his injuries. The burns on his face and hands were severe but treatable. The poison, though, she recognized the symptoms now. Satchel, what the Mexicans called devil's trumpet, what the whites called Jimson weed. Someone had wanted him unable to escape, but conscious enough to know he was burning. Cruel, calculated. This was murder disguised as accident. The horses in the barn were still screaming. Aiyana looked between the marshal and the trapped animals, making another choice. She couldn't save them all, but she could try. Moving quickly, she ran to the barn, lifting the heavy bar that secured the doors. They burst open, horses streaming out in panic, nearly trampling her in their desperation to escape. 6 horses freed, running into the darkness. At least something lived tonight. When she returned, the marshal was convulsing. The poison was reaching a critical stage. Without intervention, he would die before dawn, fire or no fire. Aiyana made her 3rd choice of the night, the one that would seal both their fates. She couldn't treat him here, too exposed, too dangerous. But taking him to her secret place meant trusting him with knowledge that could destroy her. The sacred spring. It was the only way. She whistled softly, a sound that mimicked a nighthawk. Within moments, her horse emerged from the darkness. A paint mare trained to come silent and swift. Getting the marshal across the saddle took all her remaining strength. She mounted behind him, holding his unconscious form steady, and guided them away from the inferno. The journey to the hidden canyon took an hour, though it felt like days. 3 times the marshal nearly slipped from the saddle. 3 times she held him steady, whispering prayers in Apache that he couldn't hear. The poison was causing his muscles to spasm randomly, his breathing becoming more erratic. The entrance to the canyon was concealed by a fall of rocks and a screen of ancient cottonwoods. Unless you knew exactly where to look, you'd ride past a dozen times and never see it. Aiyana guided them through the narrow passage that opened into a wider space where the spring bubbled up from deep earth. Her shelter was simple but well supplied, a cave naturally formed by water and wind, improved by generations of her people. Woven blankets, stores of dried herbs, tools for healing. She'd lived here 2 years now, since the last of her band had been forced onto the reservation or killed. She laid the marshal on a bed of pine boughs covered with blankets, finally able to examine him properly by lamplight. The badge read S. Kane, no first name. His face beneath the burns was weathered by sun and wind, placing him somewhere in his 30s. His hands had calluses from guns and ropes, but also a thin scar across the palm that looked like a defensive wound. Someone who'd fought with more than bullets. The poison first. She forced his mouth open, pouring a mixture of activated charcoal and sacred spring water down his throat. He choked, sputtered, but swallowed. Good. His body was still fighting. The burns next. She carefully removed his shirt, revealing more burns across his chest and arms. The sacred water would help, but she needed her grandmother's salve. Honey, aloe, and herbs known only to her people. As she worked, she sang the healing songs, low and rhythmic, the ones that called on the spirits of plants and water to lend their strength. Hours passed. The marshal, Kane, drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words she couldn't understand. Sometimes he called out names: Marcus, Sarah, no, don't trust him. Other times he spoke of fires, of papers, of betrayal. Dawn came slowly to the hidden canyon, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and amber. Silas Kane woke to sensations. He couldn't immediately place the sound of water over stone, the smell of sage and something sweet, the feeling of coolness on burns he didn't remember receiving. His eyes wouldn't focus properly at first. When they did, he found himself looking at a ceiling of natural stone, smooth and curved like the inside of a shell. Petroglyphs marked one wall, spirals and figures that seemed to dance in the flickering light of a small fire. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his chest and arms, and his head spun with vertigo that had nothing to do with injury, and everything to do with what? The last thing he remembered was drinking coffee in his ranch house, studying the map that showed the pattern of fires, and then, "Don't move." The voice was soft-accented female. A figure moved into his field of vision, and his hand instinctively went for a gun that wasn't there. She was Apache. Young, though her eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen too much. Her black hair was bound in a traditional style he'd seen in photographs but never in person. She wore a simple dress of doeskin and trade cloth, decorated with beadwork that caught the firelight. Her hands, when she reached toward him, showed the competence of a healer. He flinched away, and she stopped holding her palms up in a universal gesture of peace. "I won't hurt you," she said in careful English. "You were poisoned, burned. I brought you here to heal." Silas's throat felt like sand. When he tried to speak, only a croak emerged. She moved slowly, deliberately, bringing him a cup of water. Not ordinary water. It had a slight mineral taste, almost effervescent, and seemed to spread coolness through his entire body. "Sacred spring water," she explained, sitting back on her heels at a respectful distance. "It helps with healing." His mind was starting to piece things together. The ranch, the fire. But before that, Morrison, he said the name coming suddenly. "I was investigating Morrison's death. The pattern." He tried to sit up again, and this time she helped him, propping him against the stone wall. "Your ranch burned 3 nights ago," she said. "Morrison's was 2 weeks before. I've been watching. The fires aren't accidents. 3 nights. He'd lost 3 entire days. Why did you save me?" His voice was rough, suspicious. He was a lawman, had been a lawman, and Apache had no reason to love the law. She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth to share. "The water showed me you were different, that you were seeking justice, not just following orders." She gestured to his badge, which she'd placed on a rock nearby. "Also, whoever tried to kill you used satchel, a poison to keep you conscious while you burned. Only someone truly evil does that." Silas absorbed this. His memories were returning in fragments. He'd been investigating a string of ranch fires that followed the creek line. Insurance claims pointed to accident, but the pattern suggested otherwise. Then he'd found evidence that his own captain was involved, taking bribes to look the other way while someone systematically cleared the valley. "Captain Morrison," he said suddenly. "He wasn't a rancher. He was. God, he was investigating the same thing. We were both getting close." The full implication hit him. They killed him and made it look like another ranch fire. Then they came for me. The Apache woman nodded. "The poison was in your coffee. I could smell it when I found you. Whoever did this knew your routine," which meant someone close to him, someone he'd trusted. Over the next days, for his healing took days, not hours, they developed a strange rhythm. She would tend his burns with salves that smelled of honey and herbs, changing his bandages with gentle efficiency. He would share what he remembered about the investigation, piecing together the conspiracy from fragments of memory. Her name was Aiyana, she finally told him, though she was reluctant to share more. She spoke enough English to communicate, and he knew perhaps a dozen words of Apache, mostly commands he'd learned in his cavalry days. They made do with gestures, drawings in the dirt, and a growing understanding that transcended language. She taught him to recognize the herbs she used, which ones brought down fever, which cleaned wounds, which eased pain. He'd always dismissed native medicine as superstition, but the evidence of his own healing body was undeniable. The burns that should have left him scarred were healing clean. The poison that should have killed him was leaving his system without lasting damage. In return, he showed her how to better maintain the revolver she carried, an old Colt that had been her father's. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp, but her technique needed refinement. He taught her the breath control that made the difference between hitting a target and hitting exactly where you aimed. Trust came slowly built through small actions. The way she would announce herself before entering the cave, respecting his instinct to reach for absent weapons. The way he began to drink the medicine she offered without hesitation. The evening he helped her gather herbs by the spring, learning to see the subtle differences between healing plants and their poisonous cousins. "Your people," he said one evening, as they sat by the spring watching stars emerge in the strip of sky visible above the canyon walls. "Where are they?" Her silence stretched long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. Then dead. Scattered. Forced onto the reservation at San Carlos. She threw a pebble into the spring, watching ripples distort the reflected stars. "I stay here because someone must remember the old ways. Someone must keep the spring sacred. Alone keeps me alive." She looked at him sideways. Usually. There was something in that look, not romantic, not yet, but a recognition. Two solitary souls who had chosen isolation for survival, brought together by conspiracy and flame. The night Silas's fever finally broke completely was the night the memories flooded back in full. He woke gasping, sweat-soaked, despite the cool air, Aiyana's hand on his shoulder grounding him to the present. "You were dreaming," she said simply, but her eyes said she understood the territory of nightmares. "Not dreaming, remembering." He sat up, running a hand through his hair. "I know who's behind this. Barrett. Clayton Barrett." She knew the name. Everyone in the valley did. Barrett owned the largest mercantile in Bitter Creek, had interests in mining cattle, anything that turned profit. He also had connections back east, investors, hungry for Western opportunities. "He wants the water rights, Silas," continued, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "The whole valley depends on this creek system. Control the water, control everything. But he couldn't just buy the land. Too many small holders, too many families who'd rather die than sell their only legacy. So he burns them out." Aiyana finished. "Makes it look accidental. Survivors sell cheap and leave. Dead men's relatives back east are happy to take any offer." Silas nodded. "My Captain Morrison figured it out. They killed him for it. And when I started asking questions," he gestured to his healing burns. "You have proof, I had proof. Documents linking Barrett to the insurance investigators, payments to certain officials. It was all in my house." He laughed bitterly. "Ash now." Aiyana was quiet for a moment, then rose and went to a corner of the cave he hadn't paid attention to before. She returned with a leather satchel, water-stained and partially burned. "This was in your root cellar," she said, handing it to him. "I went back the second night after the fire died, to see if anything survived." With trembling hands, Silas opened the satchel. Inside, damaged but readable, were copies of several documents he'd made. Not everything, but enough. Bills of sale with suspicious dates, insurance claims with identical wording, a partial letter in Barrett's own hand, discussing clearing the creek line. This could be enough, he breathed. Then reality set in. "If anyone would believe me, officially I'm dead." Barrett made sure of that. "Even if I showed up alive, who'd believe a marshal who supposedly burned in his own house over the word of Clayton Barrett? Then we make them believe," Aiyana said with quiet determination. The next morning she showed him something she'd never shown another living soul, a hidden vantage point above the valley where you could see for miles. Through a pair of field glasses her father had taken from a dead soldier years ago, they could observe the ranches along the creek. "There," she said, pointing to a small homestead. "The Hendersons. Arrived last month. See the pattern?" Silas looked. Surveyor's stakes marked a line that followed the creek. Fresh wagon tracks led to and from the property. Too many for normal ranch business. "They're already marking them," he said. "Barrett's getting bold. Or desperate. Your death should have ended the investigation." Instead, people are asking questions. The Hendersons have been talking to neighbors wondering about all the fires. Over the following days, they developed a routine of observation. Aiyana would venture out at dawn and dusk, checking on the families along the creek, sometimes leaving medicine or food where it would be found. Silas, still too weak and too recognizable to risk exposure, documented everything they observed. It was during one of these observation sessions that Aiyana shared her own secret. My family, she said, field glasses trained on the valley, lived where the Morrison Ranch now stands. 3 generations ago, before any settlers came, the sacred spring was where we performed healing ceremonies, coming-of-age rites. Morrison bought the land fair and square, Silas said carefully, from whom she lowered the glasses to look at him, who owned it to sell. The government that said all land not actively farmed was empty, the same government that sent cavalry to ensure it stayed empty. He had no good answer for that. I don't hate the settlers, she continued, surprising him. Most are just families trying to survive, same as mine was. But men like Barrett, her jaw tightened, they destroy everything they touch. Apache settler doesn't matter. Just obstacles to profit. That evening, as she changed his bandages, Silas found himself studying her hands. They were strong, calloused from work, but gentle. A healer's hands. When she looked up and caught him watching, something passed between them, not quite understanding, not yet trust, but possibility. When this is over, he said quietly, what will you do? Survive, she said simply. It's what I always do. That's not living, says the man who lived alone on a ranch for 2 years, investigating crimes because he had nothing else. Her tone wasn't cruel, just observant. He couldn't argue with that. That night, she taught him some Apache words. Water to fire co-friend, Shichine. He taught her card games his mother had loved, using pine needles for stakes. When she laughed at his terrible bluff, it transformed her face, revealing the young woman beneath the survivor's mask. You should smile more, he said without thinking. The smile faded. Give me reasons to. The next day brought those reasons in the worst possible way. The smoke was visible from their lookout point, black, oily, wrong. Not a ranch fire this time, but something else. Aiyana trained the field glasses on the source, her knuckles white on the metal. The old Apache camp, she said, voice carefully neutral. Where some of my people still hide sometime. Where children go when they run from the reservation schools. There had been no one there yesterday. They'd checked. But the message was clear. Barrett knew Aiyana existed, knew she'd been helping, and was drawing her out. Worse was what came next. Riders, a full posse, heading up from town toward the sacred spring. Leading them was Sheriff Watson, a man Silas had once considered honest, if lazy. They know where you live, he asked urgently. No. But they know the general area. They'll search every canyon. She lowered the glasses. Someone talked. Someone saw me. They prepared quickly. Aiyana gathered her most essential herbs and medicines while Silas checked their weapons. He was moving better now, 2 weeks of healing, having worked miracles, though he still tired easily. We should run, he said. Head south to Mexico or north to No. Her voice was firm. I won't be driven from the last sacred place. And you won't run from the truth about Barrett. Then what, she looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much. We fight, but smart. Apache way. The first part of her plan involved misdirection. She left false trails leading away from the sacred canyon toward the harsh badlands where no one could survive long. Silas, meanwhile, used charcoal and dirt to write messages on flat rocks where the posse would find them. Barrett burns families alive. Check the dates on the insurance claims. Morrison was murdered. Seeds of doubt. Nothing more yet. The posse spent 3 days searching, getting closer each time. From their hiding spots, Silas and Aiyana watched Sheriff Watson grow increasingly frustrated. Several deputies were already grumbling about wild goose chases. On the 3rd night, things escalated. A rider came up from town. One of Barrett's men, Silas, recognized him. Heated words were exchanged with Watson, though they couldn't hear specifics. Then, the rider handed over what looked like a wanted poster. Watson's whole demeanor changed. He gathered his men, and Silas heard him clearly this time. "Forget the Apache woman. We're looking for Silas Kane. He's alive, and there's a $1,000 bounty for him, dead or alive." Aiyana looked at him. "How does Barrett know you're alive?" Silas thought back. "The satchel. Someone must have seen you at the burned ranch. Or—" A worse thought occurred. "He never believed I was dead. This whole thing, hunting you, burning the Apache camp, it's all to flush me out." That night they held council in the cave. The spring bubbled beside them, its sound usually calming now seeming to whisper urgency. "I should turn myself in," Silas said. "Face Barrett directly. You'd be dead before you reached the jail. Then I draw them away. You stay hidden until no—" She placed a hand on his arm the first time she'd touched him voluntarily outside of healing. "We're stronger together. My knowledge of the land, your knowledge of the law. The law won't help us now. Then we make new law." Her eyes gleamed in the firelight. Apache law, survival law. They were interrupted by sounds from outside, horses' voices getting closer. The posse had found the canyon entrance. Moving quickly, silently, they retreated deeper into the cave system. Aiyana led him through passages he hadn't known existed deeper into the mountain where the sacred spring originated. The walls grew damp, the sound of water everywhere. "There's another exit," she whispered, "but we'll have to swim." The underground pool was black as night, fed by the spring and leading to another chamber. Aiyana went first, her head disappearing beneath the surface. Silas counted, 30 seconds, 40, 50, before following. The water was shockingly cold, the passage completely dark. He swam, blind, lungs burning, trusting that Aiyana knew the way. Just when panic started to set in, his head broke the surface. She pulled him up onto a ledge, both of them gasping. They were in another cave, this one opening onto the far side of the ridge. Behind them, echoing through the mountain, they could hear the posse searching. "They'll find our supplies," Silas said. "No, we were there. Let them. By the time they do, we'll be gone." Where she smiled, that rare expression that transformed her. To the last place they'd expect, town. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. While the posse searched the canyons for them, they would go to Bitter Creek itself, to the heart of Barrett's power, and find the evidence they needed to expose him. They traveled by night, Aiyana's paint mare carrying them both. Silas wore Apache clothing she'd modified to fit him, loose enough to hide his healing burns with a blanket that could cover his face. From a distance in darkness, they looked like any Apache couple heading to trade. They camped during the day in a hidden arroyo, and it was there, sharing the last of their water, that something shifted between them. "Why do you trust me?" Silas asked suddenly. "Your people have every reason to hate mine." Aiyana considered this, drawing patterns in the sand with a stick. "My grandmother once told me that water doesn't care about the color of the throat it quenches. The sacred spring heals Apache and white alike." She looked up at him. "And you? You seek justice, not just law." "There's a difference. Is there law is what's written by whoever holds power. Justice is what lets children sleep safe, regardless of their blood." She paused. "You could have been like the others, following orders, collecting your pay, ignoring the fires. Instead, you asked questions. Got me nearly killed, but kept your soul alive." That night, as they prepared to enter town, she gave him something. A small leather pouch on a cord. "Medicine bag," she explained. "For protection." He started to protest that he didn't believe in such things, but stopped. Hadn't her medicine saved his life? Hadn't her sacred water healed burns that should have killed him? He put it on, tucking it under his shirt where it rested against his heart. In return, he gave her his marshal's badge. "This means nothing now, but someday it might mean something again. Keep it safe." Bitter Creek at night was a different animal than during the day. The saloons were loud, the streets darker shadows moving between buildings with purposes best left unexamined. They left the horse hidden outside town and proceeded on foot. Barrett's office was above his mercantile windows, glowing with lamplight despite the late hour. Through careful observation, they determined he was there with 2 other men, Sheriff Watson and a stranger in a city suit. "Investor from back east," Silas guessed. "Come to see how the land clearing is going." They waited until the meeting ended, Watson and the stranger leaving separately. Barrett remained working at his books. This was their chance. Aiyana led the way up the back stairs, moving silent as smoke. The door was locked, but she produced tools Silas didn't know she possessed, working the mechanism with practiced ease. Where did you learn that Apache children taken to reservation schools learn many things? Not all of them intended. The office was opulent. Persian rugs, leather chairs, a massive oak desk, and behind that desk a safe. Can you? Silas asked. She shook her head. That's beyond my skills. Then we find another way. They searched quickly, efficiently. Ledgers showed legitimate business, nothing incriminating. Letters were similarly innocent. Then Aiyana found something. A hidden compartment in the desk revealed when she accidentally pressed a carved rose. Inside were the real documents. Insurance claims for fires that hadn't happened yet, dated in advance. Bills of sale for properties still occupied by living families. A list of names with dates beside them. The Hendersons were marked for next week. My God, Silas breathed. He's got it all planned out. Every family, every fire. There's more. Aiyana held up a letter. From the governor's office. Promising federal intervention if Apache raiders become a problem. All Barrett has to do is ask. They were so absorbed in the documents that they almost missed the footsteps on the stairs. Almost. Aiyana moved first, pushing Silas behind the heavy curtains while she ducked behind the door. It opened, and Barrett entered, humming tunelessly. He went straight to his safe, not noticing anything amiss, until Aiyana stepped out. Her father's Colt trained on him. Don't move, she said quietly. Barrett froze, then slowly raised his hands. The Apache witch. I wondered when you'd show yourself. Not a witch. Just someone who won't watch more families burn. Barrett's eyes flicked to the desk, seeing the open compartment. His face went pale, then red with rage. You have no idea what you're interfering with. This is bigger than some savage girl playing hero. Big enough to murder children in their beds. Progress requires sacrifice. This valley will be the jewel of the territory once it's properly developed. The railroad will come through. Industry will flourish, and you'll be rich. Everyone will benefit. Even your people eventually. Civilization, education, reservation schools, where they beat children for speaking their language. Civilization that poisons men and burns them alive. Silas stepped out from behind the curtain, very much alive and very angry. Barrett's shock was almost comical. Kane, you're supposed to be dead. Disappointed. Like you were disappointed when Captain Morrison wouldn't take your bribes. Morrison was a fool. And you're following in his footsteps. Barrett's hand moved slightly toward his desk drawer. Don't, Aiyana warned. But Barrett was already moving, yanking open the drawer and pulling out a derringer. He fired once, the small gun loud in the enclosed space. Aiyana twisted aside, the bullet grazing her shoulder. Her return shot was more accurate, catching Barrett in the thigh and sending him crashing to the floor. Shouts came from the street below. The shot had been heard. We need to go, Silas said, grabbing the incriminating documents. Wait. Aiyana knelt beside the groaning Barrett, pressing her hand to his wound. Not to help, to ensure he stayed conscious. You will live. You will stand trial. And you will remember the Apache woman who stopped you. They fled through the window across rooftops as the town came alive below them. Someone had found Barrett. And soon everyone would know Silas Kane was alive, and Aiyana was real. They made it to the horse, galloping away as torches gathered in the town behind them. But they didn't head for Mexico or the Badlands. They rode toward the sacred spring where everything would end. The posse found them at dawn, surrounding the canyon with no escape possible. Sheriff Watson led them, his face grim, Barrett's blood on his shirt from helping the wounded man. Come out, Kane, he called. Both of you. It's over. Silas and Aiyana stood at the spring's edge, watching the sun paint the red rocks gold. The documents were hidden, but without testimony they might not be enough. I'm sorry, he told her. I brought this to your door. No, you brought justice to mine. She touched the marshal's badge she wore hidden beneath her dress. And maybe redemption. They walked out together, hands raised. Watson's men trained rifles on them, fingers tense on triggers. The sheriff himself looked conflicted, uncertain. Sheriff Silas said clearly, I have evidence that Clayton Barrett has been murdering families along this creek for their land. Insurance fraud, conspiracy, murder for profit. Barrett says you're the one setting fires. You and the Apache woman. Then how did I burn my own ranch while poisoned inside it? Watson frowned. Poisoned Jimson weed in my coffee. Ask Dr. Henley to examine Barrett's office. He'll find traces of it, I guarantee. Murmurs ran through the posse. Several men looked uncomfortable. Even if that's true, Watson began. He was interrupted by new arrivals. 3 riders coming hard from town, one of them the Eastern investor from the night before. But as he got closer, Silas realized his mistake. This was no investor. Federal Marshal James Brennan, the man announced, producing a badge. I've been investigating suspicious land deals in this territory for 6 months. His eyes found Silas. Marshal Kane, glad to see you're not dead after all. Relief flooded through Silas. Brennan, you got Morrison's messages eventually. Took time to verify, get federal authority. Brennan turned to Watson. Sheriff, I'll need you to arrest Clayton Barrett for conspiracy, fraud, and murder. We have enough evidence to hang him twice over. But Watson looked between them, confused. Barrett said Barrett lied, as men like him always do. Brennan's eyes moved to Aiyana. Ma'am, I understand you've been instrumental in protecting the families along this creek. The federal government owes you a debt. Aiyana said nothing, her hand finding Silas's. The trial was a sensation. Clayton Barrett, pillar of the community, exposed as a murderer who'd burned families alive for profit. The documents Silas and Aiyana had found, combined with Federal Marshal Brennan's investigation, painted a damning picture. But the aftermath was messier than any trial. The families who'd lost everything couldn't get their land back. It had already been sold to Eastern investors who'd acted in good faith. The Apache sacred sites remained in limbo, neither protected nor officially recognized. Silas stood at the ruins of his ranch, Aiyana beside him. 3 months had passed since the trial. Barrett was awaiting execution, his conspirators imprisoned or fled. But victory felt hollow. I could rebuild, he said, looking at the blackened timbers. Insurance money savings, start over. But you won't. It wasn't a question. She knew him now perhaps better than he knew himself. No, he agreed. This place is dead. Too many ghosts. They stood in silence, watching the sun set over Bitter Creek. The water still flowed eternal and indifferent to human struggles. There's something I need to show you, Aiyana said. She led him back to the sacred spring, but this time to a part of the canyon he'd never seen. Behind a waterfall accessed by a narrow ledge was another cave. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were dozens of documents. What is this proof? She said simply. My grandfather was no fool. When the government made treaties, he demanded copies. When they were broken, he kept those too. Land grants from the Spanish before America existed here. Maps showing which springs were sacred, which valleys were winter camps. Silas examined them with growing excitement. These predate every claim Barrett made, every sale. This proves your people own this entire watershed. Owned. Past tense. These papers mean nothing in American courts. Maybe not before. But now, he thought quickly, Brennan owes us. The government is embarrassed by the Barrett scandal. If we present these at the right time to the right people, they'll find a way to dismiss them. Or they'll find a way to make a deal. Not all the land. That's gone. But the sacred sites, the spring protection for your people who remain. She looked at him skeptically. Why would they deal? Because the alternative is admitting they let Barrett murder families for land the government never legally owned in the first place. Because sometimes justice comes from embarrassment rather than conscience. It took 6 months. 6 months of legal wrangling, newspaper campaigns, and careful pressure. But in the end, the federal government established the Bitter Creek Sacred Sites Preserve, 60 acres surrounding the spring and extending into the canyon. It wasn't much a fraction of what had been taken, but it was protected inviolate. Aiyana was named official caretaker with a federal stipend for maintaining the area. It was a bitter irony, being paid to protect what had always been hers, but it provided safety and legitimacy. The night the papers were signed, they sat by the spring one last time. Silas was leaving in the morning, his marshal's appointment restored, assigned to investigate similar land frauds in Nevada. You could come with me, he said, not for the first time. You know I can't. This place needs protecting. My people need somewhere safe to remember who they are. And us. She was quiet for a long moment, her reflection wavering in the spring surface beside his. We are fire and water, Silas Kane. Sometimes they make steam powerful.